Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Trainer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Alumni in Conversation, featuring Cliff Hudson, class of 1980. So if we were together, we'd be applauding. So this is one of our showcase 150th anniversary events. So when we were planning the 150th, this is not what we envisioned. We didn't envision Zoom sessions. As some of you may have heard before we started, I'm doing this from my son's room. My son graduated from Georgetown undergraduate, so I've seized his room as he's gone to New York. And on the one side, we've got some books that I've brought in to make this look serious. And on the left, we've got the 150th banner. So this may be the only 150th banner that's out there, but delighted with this backdrop and delighted with today's event, where we're bringing Cliff Hudson, again, class of 1980, and his terrific book. So I urge you all to buy it. Master of None: How a Jack of All Trades Can Still Reach the Top. So I'm going to start with a bio, a little bit about Cliff. We're going to have a conversation, then we're going to open it up for questions from our studio audience. So if you have anything that you want to ask, just type it into the Q&A function on your screen, and I will ask that. So Cliff, first of all, welcome. Delighted to have you
Thank
here.
you. Yeah, happy to be here, Bill. Thank you for the opportunity.
So Cliff is graduate of law school, 1980, and his background before he came to law school was he has a BA in history from the University of Oklahoma. And actually, in the book, it really shows your background in history because you use history really to illuminate a lot of your points. He spent 35 years of his career at Sonic Corporation, from which he retired as CEO and chair of the board, December 2018. He's now of counsel for Crowe and Dunlevy in Oklahoma City. He's been one of our alumni leaders. Actually, I think the first time I met you was you interviewed me when I was a candidate for the deanship.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, I remember that well. Yes.
And I mean, I remember actually telling my wife, I said, this isn't, Georgetown is as impressive as I thought it was, because the chair of Sonic interviewed me. So you
and I voted for you too. So
I was hoping you would volunteer that for yourself.
There we go. Yes, there we go.
And Cliff was chair of the board of visitors for 3 years and has been really somebody I've turned to again and again during my tenure. And I'm really just so grateful to him for his leadership, and delighted to be able to have this opportunity to talk to him about his book on leadership. And that's it's particularly important to do that now, because I think as we're thinking about what defines Georgetown law, it's that we educate leaders. People follow all different career paths, but the focus on leadership, that we're training people who in different areas go out and make a difference. And so I'm actually teaching a course this semester that has 330 students, called Lawyers as Leaders, with our faculty. And I consider this really, part of that program, talking to you about leadership. So thank you for doing that. Before we get to the substance, though, Karen Greenwood from the class of 1980 asks which section you were in.
I should know. I think I was in section 4, but I don't remember Karen's name, so that would tell me she and I were probably in different sections. But I think I was in section 4.
Very good. And any particular faculty members stand out?
Well, my first year, Richard Allen Gordon stands out as my contracts professor. We had that course, of course, for the entire school year, but both because of the kind of fundamental nature of it, and also his style. He was an interesting character, and I enjoyed Professor Gordon quite a bit. And I can tell you, over the years, I could remember elements from that class, and at times could almost hear Professor Gordon, saying some of the things he said as I was practicing law, or even beyond, the years practicing law. I'd befuddle some of my counsel at times when I would repeat some of the things from Professor Gordon. But I would say Professor Gordon stood out in a very traditional sense. I also had for criminal procedure Sam Dash,
Wow.
and Sam was just wonderful. We were just a few years beyond Watergate at that point. Of course, he had been counsel to the Senate committee regarding Watergate. Sam Ervin chaired, and so that was almost magical to have him for criminal procedure, and then a variety of other folks, almost all of which were pretty strong. So I had a lot of good professors my first year.
And those are, and you are right, you were Section 4. Matt Calise has informed me.
Okay.
Right, so you start off with the correct answer. And
not sure what I win for that, but I'm glad to hear that. So yeah.
And I have to say, when I talk to alums, actually Richard Gordon and Sam Dash are often people's, strongest memories.
Yeah.
Professors.
Yeah. I also had for constitutional law, Krottenmacher. I don't know if I'm Krottenmacher, and he was very good. He was really very good. So a number of folks that were strong that I recall very fondly. But so yeah.
Well, very good. Well, they launched you on a good career. So
yeah, they did. Yeah, I think in terms of critical thinking and explanation of critical thinking, Georgetown was a great training ground for me. I was in my 20s, as probably majority of the law students are, and it was a enormously formative time, personally and intellectually. So,
and so you've followed kind of a very non-traditional path. So let me just start with that. How did your Georgetown law education contribute to your success as a CEO?
Well, first of all, I think the discussion we had just a moment ago about the critical thinking, analytical skills, it helped significantly. It did. My path into business was through law. I spent 4 years in private law practice and business practice before becoming general counsel of our company, which is Sonic Corp. And so law was essential to getting in there in the first place. I do think, and I can recall this over the years, that the discipline as a lawyer to really kind of dig in, understand, attempt to separate things that some people don't see as being separable, much less whether they ask that question in the first place, or seeing similarities amongst elements that where other people only see differences. These are good analytical skills that I think help you in, particularly in an organization where you can have impact. And I think about that because the organization I joined is relatively small and relatively thin on senior staff. So a person who was a strong critical thinker and could be an honest broker in laying that out for a management team could quickly start playing a leadership role, even if it went strictly under the title of being general counsel. So I think those skills helped me enormously. I was, as I said, general counsel for a company that really was in a turnaround phase. And on a parallel path, I was general counsel of a company that my boss, the CEO, wanted to acquire. And so he wanted a sophisticated business counsel that could help him, frankly, help him quietly analyzing and attempt to buy the company. So I was general counsel for 8 years. The education at Georgetown was obviously critical to that. And I would say, even once I was no longer general counsel, the preparation that I had from, a critical thinking standpoint was enormous, throughout my career. And the credibility that Georgetown brings in almost any circle. In a business setting, you can walk into the setting and if someone says, the lawyer's here, you might get people kind of pucker up, wonder what's next. But it's an interesting thing for my dynamic when I say, yes, I attended Georgetown Law and here's what I do now. And so it almost puts people from that standpoint, it seemed to put people at ease because they understood that they seemed to understand the path was a different one, a serious one, and that perhaps I was there for serious purposes, not for mischief, So I think the Georgetown law degree implicitly and explicitly has helped me throughout my career.
And you also, I mean, we'll get to some of the larger themes, but you didn't come out of a business background. You studied history as an undergraduate. Is that a plus or?
That is, well, I think it's a plus, but because I had a tendency to all my years of running Sonic, and even before I was running it, when an issue would come up, just trying to think about how we would go forward, many of the people that were involved in our company were often they were tactical, but aside from that, I think the effort towards strategy that influenced me was my history background. And so whenever I would attempt to answer the question of where do we go from here, I invariably looked back. Where have we been? What worked? What didn't work? When it didn't work, why didn't it work? And there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with that kind of inquiry, which is pretty silly, I think. But I think it's essential to a healthy and strong, or building a healthy and strong organization, because you obviously don't want to keep making the same mistakes time and again. So I would say, Bill, the funny thing is that having no business background, so to speak, was a bigger issue in my head than it was in fact. And for many years, while I was even once I became the CEO, I thought I would think, gee, well, it just wasn't my deal. As an undergraduate student, at my father's suggestion, I enrolled in an accounting class, and I went to class one day, and I dropped the course and picked up a cultural anthropology course to give you a sense of what made me tick. And that was just so I picked up on the job a lot of accounting. I picked up corporate finance in a huge way because I had no background with that. But that was all OJT. And after general counsel, I actually spent a year as the chief financial officer of the company. It was pre Sarbanes-Oxley. Don't think that would happen today, but nonetheless, all of it enormous on-the-job training, and but having, I think, strong analytical skills, willingness to look back, see what went wrong, own it, try to fix it. It really helped me understand, why our company was a turnaround company, where things had gone wrong, and perhaps how to head some of that off, prospectively. So.
And did it give you, just reading your book, I was struck by, you talk about a lot of business leaders, but you also talk about, historical figures like Eisenhower or Patton, Wilson, right? So did that,
right.
That kind of shape your concept of leadership, historical examples?
Yes, I think there were, yes. Interestingly, I am relatively sure I read, I think a 2-volume set, it might have been 3, but a 2-volume set on Eisenhower while I was a student at Georgetown.
Huh.
And really in all my years post undergraduate, my reading has been, almost exclusively, historical biographies and or just history. So, so I was struck with Eisenhower. He was a more kind of down the middle of the road sort of guy maybe than I see myself being, but he was a very moderate, moderating orientation. As a matter of fact, when Truman, I decided he wasn't going to run for re-election, focusing on 1952. He actually recruited Eisenhower to run for president. Eisenhower was non-committal, popped up later running, but running as a Republican. And there's no end of chagrin to Truman that here he was trying to recruit the guy, and the guy never said, if I run, I'm going to run as a Republican, because I'm sure Truman would have stopped the recruiting back right there, So, yes, reading about the style of someone like Eisenhower and how he behaved. Of course, in the book, I point out the contrast of his operating style versus um, his peers in the army at the time of World War II. Much more of a collaborative style, and part of it was his position, but a lot of it was his nature. And this was parallel to my own upbringing, which I talk about in the book, of my leadership positions not coming in. They were all in circumstances that were very group focused, group dynamics, high levels of collaboration, and very little kind of unilateral pull the trigger sort of stuff. So I admired people who pursued more. I admired the Eisenhower character more than the Patton character by far.
And it's very striking to me that, you talk about what's really a collaborative leadership style.
Yes.
You know, so, that, how did you develop that? Is that, and, you talk about your childhood and high school, but, for the people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, which I urge everybody to, because it's terrific, how
Right.
did you develop your personal leadership style?
Well, I think the first, as an adolescent, the first teacher I had who had a sense that I might provide some leadership in her circumstance was, and I do talk about this in the book, was a junior high school choir conductor, choir teacher, the boys' glee club teacher, and she really kind of helped pull me into leadership in that setting. I mean, literally to the degree that when she was absent from the class, I would go into the boys' glee club with 40, 50 boys, ages 12 to 14 years old, lead them through warm up exercises and before singing the pieces that we were to practice. When she was absent from the class, we had a substitute teacher, but as substitute teachers go, the substitute teacher knew nothing about music, So that was my job to take them through exercises and then literally practicing the tunes. So that really gave me a different view of myself, at 13, 14 years old. I mean, it is a heady experience to stand in front of, 40 boys your own age and get them to sing 4-part harmonies. I mean, that's an interesting experience. As I got into high school, I started a high school, public school, where it was the first year of court-ordered desegregation. And so it was a very different culture. I had always gone to segregated schools. And so it was a very different culture, very different setting, and suddenly one in which meeting kids of different backgrounds and value systems and orientation and so on was quite significant. And the place was full of the city and the school was full of racists. And this was not my parents' orientation. It wasn't my orientation. And so I was pulled very quickly towards, you might say, peacemaking, but relationship building with kids of a variety of backgrounds. And as I talk about in the book, this was a big theme for me in high school and in my first real leadership position, getting elected student body president for my senior year, and with a very diverse student population, winning a majority of the votes on the first ballot. And I think it spoke in no small part to my attempt to build coalitions and have a very collaborative leadership style, which is one, when I got into the franchising business, then as an adult, it seemed to be the only way to try to lead a franchising business, because these fellows they had invested millions of dollars, and you really had to find a process to bring them along other than attempting in any way to dictate to them, because that wasn't going to work.
So, I mean, it seemed to me that, when you're talking about high school and then kind of moving that forward to, your leadership of Sonic, the two of the themes are, collaboration rather than kind of mandating, right?
Right. Yes.
And then the other is the importance of different voices.
Yes. Yes. And I do try to make that quite clear in my book. I mean, part of the attempt in the book is to tell my story. Part of it is to tell the Sonic story and how we went about having success. But part of it is also to make very clear the the joy of diversity.
Mhm.
And that also, of course, goes to diverse voices, whether in a management room or in a student council or whatever that is. My One of the things I point out after being CEO for I think 20, I don't know how many years it was, but 20 plus years, our my management team and my board were the subject of a very nice piece in the New York Times talking about diversity and the fact that I had 10 outside board members, 10 independent board members, a majority of whom were not white males. And the writer for the New York Times saying, this is really a rarity in corporate America. So we were, a multi-billion-dollar publicly held company. So it kind of, I think, held us out as a model of sorts. I think fair to say, but that is something that I learned early on, and something I attempted to utilize, throughout my career.
So when you, so let's go back. What made you decide to go to law school?
Well, that's a good question. In those same teen years, when I would move throughout the community, I was very involved in local politics and community activities, and the people that I would see. And I have to say this was primarily men because that was the case at the time. This would have been the 1970s. The men that I saw in leadership positions in the community consistently came from legal education background. Some of them were practicing lawyers. Some were politicians, and they did a little law and they did their political activity. Some were business folks or in education. But the people that I saw that I said, gee, I'd like to do what they're doing, almost invariably had law degrees. And so in law school, I think I pretty much in high school. In high school, I pretty much decided I wanted to go into law. There was a short period of time in undergrad school where I thought about doing something different, but it was a very short period of time. And I applied for law school while in undergraduate, went pretty much straight into law school. So it was something I focused on early. Not sure path. What I saw in these fellas, and when I was in my teens, and the folks that had law degrees, I saw a lot of versatility and diversity in their activity, and my reaction was that looks and feels pretty good. I wanted that kind of flexibility. Not sure if I'd end up in business or government, politics, law practice, whatever. I wasn't sure what path on, but I felt the law would give me that base to consider various options, and in fact, it has.
And then, what brought you to Georgetown?
I kind of decided that it would be good to. Well, there's a couple of things. One, I thought it'd be good to be in Washington, D.C. for law school. And I think that was right. I also, at the time, thought I wanted to study some international law, which I did do at Georgetown. There's some decisions I made that kind of put me not on that path. But I thought I'd like to include international law in those studies. So I did take several courses with Professor Wolf and others at Georgetown in international law. So I applied to Georgetown, George Washington, and American University. Got into all three, and you'll be pleased, of course, that I chose Georgetown of those three. So.
Well, very glad you did.
Yeah, right. 50 years later, or whatever it is. Right, 40 years later. Yeah.
And then when you graduated from law school, did you have the sense that you could start with corporate law, or how'd you choose your first?
Well, good question. So to my surprise, in law school, the course that I started enjoying more than I've anticipated was corporate law. I had Jeff Bauman. And he was entertaining in the way he went about it, which was good for me. But I also just found I kind of took to it, and that that surprised me. So I ended up taking corporations, securities, and business planning with Jeff Bauman, and this was I found it stimulating, interesting, and the idea I thought, particularly the idea of working with small business and entrepreneurs might be interesting. So the studies at Georgetown, I did enjoy the international law. I think if I had wanted to go the international path, I should have jumped into the LLM program. Excuse me, I should have jumped into the JD Masters program in the School of Foreign Service, and that probably would have put me more on that path. But I obviously didn't, and I think that limited some of my opportunities as I was finishing law school. But my wife was accepted into Johns Hopkins University, and so basically what I did to support that, she had helped support me for 3 years. I looked for a job in Baltimore and took a job with a kind of old line corporate law firm in Baltimore for 2 years while she was at Hopkins, and then basically did the same type of practice when we returned to Oklahoma City 2 years after my graduation in '82, and had a business, was involved in a corporate securities practice, private practice there as well.
So what brought you to Oklahoma City?
Well, my parents had moved there. My entire family is from Texas, and we were all born in Dallas. What happened, which is kind of critical in my life and a critical turn of the life, but also something that influenced my some of my thought processes and planning, and some conservative elements personally that occurred when I was a kid. When I was finishing elementary school, my dad was quite an entrepreneur, and you could say a serial entrepreneur. Most of his life, he was running his own business, and at times they ran extremely well, and at times they didn't. As I was finishing elementary school, downturn in the economy in the area, the story, as I was told, his partner had been supporting a girlfriend right out of the bank account of the company. And when the economy turned down, that became apparent. The business failed. My dad and his partner, but my parents really lost everything, including our home. And we ended up moving mostly so that he could take a position, which for some, I'd say 12, 24 months, he was in a sales position that necessitated apparently him being at the intersection of Interstate 35, Interstate 40. And that meant Oklahoma City. So as I was finishing elementary school, we moved to Oklahoma City. And I would say within 2 years, my dad was back into a completely entrepreneurial situation. And in 1966, after having filed bankruptcy in 1968, he was flying between job flights in his own plane.
Wow!
So
Wow.
this was the kind of swings that he experienced in his business, which I the decision not to experience those same swings, But that's what took us to Oklahoma City. And that's, as I said in the book and mentioned earlier, that's where I went to junior high and high school.
So did your father's experience, did that make you more inclined to entrepreneurship or less?
Maybe enjoy the entrepreneurship, but it also, one thing when I think about him and what I knew about him as I moved into business in my adulthood, I think my father had no concept of retained earnings. And so this was one of the things that affected me was take some off the table and put yourself in a better position long term. But also, I think when my wife and I don't know what, we were 30 something years old. The first time I came into some money from a business standpoint, first thing I did was just pay off the house and never mortgage it again. But that of course was straight out of my childhood, So yeah.
So so you moved to Oklahoma City. That's where your parents were. And was this really was this the oil boom era?
When they heard I moved, they called off the oil boom. I mean, the oil boom, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82. When I would go back and visit, I just couldn't believe the energy of the place. No pun intended. It was it was exciting. And the young lawyers that I knew and other folks, just the vibrancy of the community. And along with that, of course, the ease of raising money, ease of borrowing money to get into business. And so we moved there in 82, and the timing, if you wanted to avoid a tough economy, the timing couldn't have been worse, because we did move back and move there in the spring of 82, and in the summer of 82, the biggest, wildest lender that had funded a lot of the boom in the area was shut down by the federal government. And the bank was just closed. And it almost took down Continental of Illinois, and Seafirst Bank of Seattle. The feds rescued those banks, but at any rate, so yes, I mean, we moved back there in 82. I went into what I thought was a kind of a ground level opportunity to help build a firm, and they were doing some blue chip sort of work, a small business firm, corporate securities and tax work, and within 1 year, the practice had changed radically, and so I did this for 2 years with them, but I saw the entire horizon having changed in a way that was so profound that I did not see it recovering for a large part of what might be a large part of my life. And so I made the decision to leave private practice and either look, for a business to join, or, and my wife talked about at the time, leave the region. And because the region was so negatively impacted by all of this, I had a former neighbor who was an officer of Sonic and a friend. And so my thought was, well, let's invite him to some political dinners I'm going to. I knew we had similar political persuasion. Invite him and his wife and see if we can't get them as a client of the firm and do work for the company. And we had several conversations, and he invited me to come to the company, meet a new young CEO. At the time I was 29, the new CEO was 36. And I thought, this is fantastic. I mean, to meet the CEO of the company, I mean, I might be able to turn them into a pretty good client. On the meetings, of course, what they did was turn the tables and propose that I come inside. And so that same year, 84, I did come inside in August of 84 at 29 years old. I was made general counsel of the company at 29.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I mean, that's pretty. So how long were you out of law school?
4 years.
Wow.
Really what it was, and I think I alluded to this earlier, the then CEO, he wanted to buy the company and he wanted business counsel inside. What he didn't want to do was had to go hire counsel and have them, he didn't want to pay them. I'm fairly sure that was the issue. And but relatively soon after getting in, I understood that his goal really was to buy the company, which every way he explored doing it where he was the instigator never worked. And as I talk about in the book, the way we bought the company literally fell in our laps in a wild sort of twist. And once that occurred, we were off to the races. And I ended up working on 2 LBOs, one in 86 and management-led LBO in 86, and then again in 88 and the IPO in 91. So enormous on-the-job training on the whole corporate finance and deal making and understand how the company made money and didn't make money and so on. Just enormous on-the-job training. It was quite a ride.
I mean, it's amazing to think of 4 years out of law school and being general counsel for a corporation of that dimension.
Yeah. Well, it was much smaller. We bought the company. Well, we sold it 2 years ago for 2.3 billion, and it had reached in terms of system-wide sales, $4.5 billion. But it was much smaller at that time, and when we bought the company, we paid $10 million for it. So it was just a different time, different deal. So
Amazing. So I'm going to ask you some questions about that, but
okay.
Anthony Luca writes in before we get to kind of the leadership in your book. As general counsel, how do you know when it's appropriate to dive into the weeds on a technical legal issue versus delegating? Former could draw you into a series of rabbit holes, developing discrete knowledge silos, but maybe losing sight of the general counsel. But the latter has its dangers too. An issue could be missed or wrong legal conclusion reached. So
Yeah.
how do you do that? How did you strike the balance? And how
Yeah.
would you
Well, that's a great question. And the answer to it is going to vary widely based on the circumstance in which you're operating as general counsel, the size of your staff, the size of your company, the size of your budget, your ability to farm things out if you want to, and then of course what the issue itself is. But I think when I stopped being general counsel, I think we still only had like 3 attorneys, including myself, on the staff, and we really worked to do all the business practice, not the large deal transaction. If we had a large deal to buy stores, sell stores, or recapitalize the company or whatever, that was always handled outside. But so we try to do most of the standard business, the franchising work, the general corporate work inside. And that would mean, even if you had to dive into the details of that, you did that. The company at that time when I was general counsel just wasn't that big and didn't have the resources to farm out conventional, day-to-day work that was going to be done inside. Litigation was farmed out, so it wasn't by size of project. It really was by nature project, because the litigation would spring up all across the country, and it was impossible to handle that inside. So it was more a division for us. It was more a division like that. Now, if something came up, it was an in-depth project that was of business nature, but was not expertise we had, an ERISA issue or something like that, then we also just farmed that out altogether. One of the lawyers inside would stay on top of it to understand it and help guide it, but we would farm it out altogether. So I'd have to say, in our case, there were the efficiencies for the company in somebody diving deep down, as the company was paying you a salary, and so they didn't pay you by the hour if you went deep into something. And so I don't mean to wander with the question, but I think there were plenty of times where work hours permitting, we would dig very deeply into things, and it wasn't the conventional approach of will the client afford the expense, because their expense for each of us was a fixed cost. So I hope I'm answering the question, but it was less an issue of did you have to dig down deep. It was more a question of what was the nature of it, and could it practically be handled inside, or do we need to kind of just farm it out and bring in other words, get more resources by farming out the work. So
yeah, I mean, that's a terrific answer, and I think that hits the question. So now a lot of what we've been talking about is covered in the book, but let's move explicitly now to the book, which again,
okay,
recommend. It's a terrific read. So people who haven't bought it, buy it.
You can buy it on Amazon.com or Barnes and Noble, or really any book supplier online, particularly book supplier. So,
but not on your website.
That is correct. My website is at this point not set up to take orders, so that requires the question a moment ago, how deep of a dive you do. That requires a website with a deeper dive than my website does. So,
so let's go to the title, Master of None: How a Jack of All Trades Can Still Reach the Top. Where'd the title come from?
Well, in kind of working up the idea of doing the book, I look at the interest in my life, a lot of interest in music. I'm lot of activity in music over the years. Music, school leadership, civic engagement, enjoyment of history. As I mentioned earlier, history is the primary reading that I do even today. But then also law, business, education. Been very involved in public education for a lot of years and attempting to improve that on a local basis. And so rather than posturing myself as a business expert, which I felt I didn't feel, to be blunt, I didn't feel comfortable trying to posture myself that way. It felt like, because we did working with publisher, another fellow that I was working on helping pull some of this together. The theme of Master of None felt very appropriate of the stories I would be telling and the path that I had taken. It wasn't one of developing expertise. There are people you read about that say, I always wanted to be a CEO and I prepared to be a CEO and took my MBA and I did this, and finally got my chance. That wasn't my deal. It just wasn't my deal at all. I backed into it. I was almost an accidental CEO. And I tell that story in the book of how I became CEO because my boss first promoted me to chief operating officer. And then one day, he literally walked off the job. And the board turned to me and said, you want to be CEO? So I'm wandering a little bit here, but I think that Master of None for me fit. Master of None fit with the story I was going to tell. The subtitle came along later. The subtitle came literally as we were finishing the book. HarperCollins, that was the publisher. I had always assumed we'd have a subtitle, and they proposed 3 or 4 subtitles, and I came back to them and said, I feel like this one works. It describes the stories. It describes the pitch to a reader, how a jack of all trades can still reach the top in this world of specialty and focus, And so when I put that on the table with them, they said, well, give us 24 hours. They did some kind of little poll inside and they came back and said, that's it. Master of None, how a jack of all trades can still reach the top.
And it's interesting. I mean, and you talk about this in the book, we're at a time in which there's such an emphasis on mastery. So,
yes.
Gladwell talks about
yes.
10,000 hours, and
yes.
yours is a totally different approach.
Yes. And I think that it doesn't mean, I don't think you have to take the approach that one is right or wrong. My belief is if someone wants to be a brain surgeon, I hope never to have brain surgery, but if I do, I'm hoping my surgeon has a lot of expertise and focused quite well, it didn't miss much med school, So I think there are things, I remember there are things that if you want to really excel at a singular task, having that kind of focused, repetitive practice, even for years, is important. I remember watching years ago, aside from the brain surgeon, I remember watching an off-season interview with Don Mattingly, who just won the MVP or Coach of the Year, I guess, for the National League and the Marlins. But watching him when he was playing for the New York Yankees, and off-season, the number of hours of practice this guy would go through each day, including with his swing. I'm thinking this guy's already in the majors. He's been swinging at a baseball for 20 to 30 years. And here he is in the off season practicing his swing as batting machines and machine. Anyway, I thought it was fascinating. And so that level of focus, I think if you're going to play in certain arenas that are narrow and intense, the likelihood of you needing to apply many hours in a very narrow, intensive way is a pretty high degree of chance that it's something you need to do. It's hard to get there otherwise. At the same time, I don't know that that's most people. I think a liberal arts education is a great education. I think that it prepares you to embrace life on a broad basis and can prepare you to enjoy life in a richer basis than a narrow preparation. And so a person listening to this interview versus listening to Malcolm Gladwell talk about that, I don't think there's a right or wrong. If your brain tells you like agriculture, you like cultural anthropology more than you like accounting, then you're probably more of a jack of all trades than you are a specialist. And if you are, that's okay. That's good. And if that's what you like, then you're going to be good if you're doing something you like, you know. And if you pursue something you don't like because somebody told you you need to specialize, yeah, you got one life. That's a tough way to lead it, you know.
That's a great lesson. So let's talk about leadership. So what are the key characteristics in a leader?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways you can come about that. There are two fundamental ones that I think about that any effective leader needs to have. And I think this is true if you're running a small company. I think it's true if you're a principal of an elementary school. I think it's true if you're president of the United States. And those two elements that I would describe, first, I think you have to have passion for the mission of the organization. And the very thought of having a leader of an organization that lacks passion for the mission of the organization is kind of sad. And that I'm sure I know that happens at times, but and I hear stories, people talking about intergenerational transfers or whatever, and a new executive coming in that has no passion for the leadership. And I think that's tough for everybody, including the attempted leader, you know. So I say my reaction is the first thing the leader needs is passion for the mission of the organization. The next thing that I think is absolutely essential for a team to excel and for the organization to excel is that the leader needs to have compassion for the people that they're leading. And if that is absent in a leader, then it becomes very apparent to the folks that are being led, and they're less likely to follow. They're less likely to be committed. They're less likely to develop passion for the mission. Will they charge that hill with you if you're not going to charge the hill? You know, I think the answer is usually going to be no. You know, and so those two elements: passion for the mission of the organization and compassion for the people you're leading. And if you have those two things, all other things, you know, there are a lot of other things that come into effective leadership, but I think those two things are essential for an effective leader.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to just kind of cherry pick a couple points.
Okay.
How did you handle setbacks in your career as CEO?
Well, you know, it depended, of course, upon the setback, but there were times where I had really, you know, big setbacks. I would say the single biggest sustained setback was the Great Recession. In this crisis today, in this pandemic, our business, that 1950 style drive-in, is really doing fantastic because it's almost a touchless experience, and particularly if you order on an app and so on. But in the Great Recession, that wasn't true. It wasn't a question of people being fearful of interactions. It's a question of not having money. And so in 8, 9, 10, our business was really cramped, really in a tough spot. All businesses were, and people generally were. And I made some decisions, particularly in the marketing area, that I did it based on the advice of some quote experts, but it was wrong, and it was very damaging for the better part of a year. So our stock had been, from the time I became CEO in 95. I see if I can get this right, but from 1996 through 2006, I think our stock split like 5 or 6 times, and the value of the company had grown enormously. So, but let's just say when the Great Recession hit, our stock was like at $25. Well, at the low of the Great Recession, it was like $6.5, $7.
Wow.
And so my personal net worth had been badly damaged. All my employees, their personal net worth had been damaged. My franchisees. So it's tough to get up in front of 3,000 people, your employees and your franchisees, and talk about stay focused. Here's how we're going to do this, because your credibility is damaged. Your pride is hurt, you know, but you have to, as a leader in that kind of circumstance, you got to have a way that you believe, you know, you're going to lead the group out of this. And we did in a whole variety of ways, and we did, and we were very successful. But the interim was painful, and one that at times I'm sure caused my board to wonder, gee, has this guy lost it? Have we ridden this horse too long? Do we need a new CEO? But we did lead it out of the recession, and the teens were great years for our company. And as you know, mentioned earlier, bought the company for $2 billion, but then, for $10 million, and sold it for $2.3 billion in 18. So ultimately, we were very successful.
So if there was one thing that you did that you want to highlight, what would it be?
Change people's lives. So that's not so much, that didn't have to do with law. That didn't have to do with the nature of the business. I know for a fact that I had franchisees who, one franchisee that had been chair of our franchise advisory council for 15 years, got into our business from driving a bread truck and delivering a lot of bread to our stores. And you're talking about the 1960s. And he saw a business that he'd rather get into. And by the time he stepped down as chair of our franchise, this was a guy, no college education. And that bread delivery truck was probably his biggest asset. And by the time he stepped down from our franchise advisory council, he had in excess of 300 stores.
Wow.
And probably between store revenue and real estate had revenues pushing $500 million.
Wow.
And his kids and grandkids were in the business. And he was held in high esteem all across our system. Now, that's a very exaggerated story of going from, one end of the extreme to the other in terms of financial success. But I can tell you, we had example after example of people who had gotten into our business, no college education, not sure, how they could grow, what they could do. And by the time the company was sold in 2018, literally, millionaires all over the place. So I don't applaud the money. I applaud the changed lives. I applaud the fact that we had small business operators who had meager expectations and had grown up in very meager settings, and yet had become enormously successful business operators whose perspective about what they could achieve in life, and perhaps more importantly, what their children that would be permitted to achieve, changed fundamentally. And I know I played a role in helping that occur.
That's an extraordinary legacy. You got to be very proud of that. So final question. So the young Cliff Hudson equivalent, you graduated in 1980. For our students now, is there one piece of advice that you would leave them with as they're thinking about their careers?
So in a way, it kind of follows from a theme of the book, and that is, on the one hand, work hard and be diligent in any task that you pursue. Not being prepared is not going to get you anywhere. There is a term that I mentioned, not in the book, but a number of other folks. Once a company was sold, people talk about how good the company continues to do, and my comment to them has been, fortune favors the prepared. And I think that goes back some decades actually to perhaps a Navy admiral who came up with that term. But fortune does favor the prepared. You can't cause all the options to occur that may occur for you. But what you can cause is to be prepared. Your own diligence, your own work ethic, your own professionalism, you can cause that to occur at a high level. Beyond that, my advice to a younger person listening would be open. Don't keep your head down and into a workaholic mode so much that you don't see other options as they come available, that you don't see the world around you changing in a way that options can be created that you wouldn't see if you had your head down too long and too hard. So remain flexible, be open. Don't believe that you've got to create options in order for you to be attracted to those options. Most options will be, a path will be open in front of you, perhaps of your own doing at all. But if you, I think, have that degree of professionalism and diligence and an earned good reputation, it will help you get down that path. and just keep your eyes open for good options that do arise.
I mean, and that's a great way to end. One of the things that students often ask is, do I have to decide at 25 or 26, what the arc of my career is going to look like?
Right.
Your book is a great example of both hard work and being nimble at the same
Yeah.
time.
And Bill, if I could add on to that, there is a chapter in the book that says just say yes. And I talk about my progression within the company. When I joined the company, never could have imagined I would run the company, much less grow it into a multi-billion-dollar operation. But each of the steps along the way, when an opportunity was presented to me that I actually felt like was a stretch opportunity to become CFO, to become COO, to become CEO, each of these I felt like was a stretch opportunity, but I said yes. Because if I said no, it was over. And so the answer in that situation is just say yes, and then figure it out.
Yeah, I have to say that, one of the, most powerful takeaways from the book for me is your point, be willing to say yes. As we're going through this, I have to say, I keep on thinking 4 years out of law school,
Yeah.
asked to be general counsel of a company. I certainly would have hesitated. And,
Well, I'm not sure. I think I at that point at 29, I might have had more pride in my accomplishments than my accomplishments warranted. So,
well, it turned out very clearly that was a good organizational philosophy. So
yeah, it turned out fine.
Very good. So I think we're now at the hour, but I just want to. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's terrific. It's a great book on leadership, and it's also fun to read. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about Master of None, Cliff.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity.
Very good. Take care, everyone, and we'll be back with other 150th events. And just a round of applause for Cliff Hudson. Take care, all.
Okay.